Franklin D. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech, delivered on December 29, 1940, stands as one of the most consequential addresses in American history. A turning point at which the United States, still officially neutral and deeply divided over its role in world affairs, began its irreversible transformation into the principal defender of global democracy. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first grasp the extraordinary confluence of crises that shaped Roosevelt's words. Europe lay largely in ruins, crushed under the relentless advance of Nazi Germany. Britain, exhausted and bombarded, stood alone as the last major bulwark between Hitler and total domination of the continent. And the American public, haunted by the trauma and disillusionment of World War I, was profoundly wary of foreign entanglements. Into this volatile climate stepped Roosevelt, a leader who perceived with rare clarity that the struggle unfolding across the Atlantic was not a distant quarrel, but a direct threat to the very principles upon which the United States was founded. The Arsenal of Democracy speech was therefore far more than a call for increased military production. It was a sweeping argument that American security, prosperity, and moral responsibility were inextricably linked to the survival of democratic nations abroad. Roosevelt recognized that isolationism, though rooted in legitimate fears, had become a dangerous illusion in a world transformed by mechanized warfare, aerial bombardment, and the ambitions of totalitarian regimes unconstrained by law or conscience. With strategic brilliance, he sought to reshape public opinion by framing American support for Britain not as an act of intervention, but as an act of self-preservation, a crucial investment in preventing tyranny from reaching American shores. His message was direct. If Britain fell, the Atlantic would cease to be a protective barrier, and the United States would face an emboldened, resource-rich Nazi empire capable of projecting power into the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's rhetoric combined urgency with reassurance, painting a vivid picture of the stakes while emphasizing that Americans could help defeat fascism without sending their sons to battlefields overseas. The arsenal metaphor crystallized this strategy by suggesting that factories, workers, and industrial might, not troops, would be America's first great contribution to the global fight for freedom. At a time when government policy was constrained by the Neutrality Acts and public skepticism, Roosevelt's framing offered a middle ground between complacency and full-scale war, presenting military production as both a patriotic duty and an economic opportunity in the wake of the Great Depression. He appealed not only to logic, but also to emotion, invoking the nation's founding ideals and reminding listeners that democratic societies, bound by their shared belief in human dignity, must stand together against the darkness gathering across the world. Yet Roosevelt's task was far from simple. Isolationist sentiment, embodied most prominently by the America First Committee and influential figures like Charles Lindbergh, warned that aiding Britain would inevitably drag the nation into another catastrophic war. Roosevelt confronted these arguments head-on, skillfully dismantling the notion that neutrality could shield America from the consequences of global collapse. He emphasized that refusing to act would not prevent war, but would guarantee that the United States faced it alone, unprepared, and against a vastly strengthened enemy. Through this reasoning, Roosevelt reframed the debate. The real risk lay not in helping Britain survive, but in allowing Hitler to win. The speech also marked a pivotal moment in Roosevelt's evolving doctrine of American leadership. While earlier administrations had focused primarily on domestic recovery, Roosevelt increasingly viewed international stability as essential to long-term security and prosperity at home. The arsenal of democracy thus served as both a warning and a declaration of a new strategic orientation, one in which the United States would assume a central role in shaping the fate of the free world. This shift would become even more pronounced after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but its intellectual and moral foundation was laid powerfully in late 1940. Roosevelt's message resonated deeply because it acknowledged the fears of ordinary Americans, the fear of repeating past mistakes, the fear of economic hardship, the fear of sending loved ones to war, while guiding them toward a broader understanding of their place in a rapidly changing world. His voice, calm and resolute, carried into millions of homes through the radio, providing a sense of clarity at a time of global uncertainty. By the time the speech ended, Americans had been invited to see themselves not as bystanders to history, but as active participants in the preservation of democratic civilization. The impact of this address reverberated far beyond the immediate policy changes it justified. It rallied industries, boosted morale in Britain, weakened isolationist influence, and laid the groundwork for the Lend-Lease program, which would become a lifeline for nations resisting the Axis powers. More broadly, it signaled the emergence of an American identity deeply intertwined with the defense of freedom worldwide, an identity that shaped U.S. foreign policy for the remainder of the 20th century and continues to influence global geopolitics today. The speech demonstrated Roosevelt's unparalleled ability to educate, persuade, and mobilize a nation at a crossroads. It fused strategic foresight with moral conviction, transforming the concept of American democracy into a domestic ideal, into a global responsibility. In retrospect, the Arsenal of Democracy speech can be seen as a hinge point between two eras, the end of American isolation and the beginning of American global leadership. Its power lies not only in its historical consequences, but in its enduring message that democracy, to survive, requires vigilance, unity, and the courage to act before the forces of destruction become unstoppable. As the world spiraled deeper into chaos and uncertainty, Roosevelt offered a vision that transcended fear and division, reminding Americans that their strength did not lie solely in their weapons or wealth, but in their unwavering commitment to the principles of liberty and human dignity. In doing so, he transformed the psychology of a nation and set in motion a movement that would shape the outcome of World War II and the trajectory of the modern world. The arsenal of democracy was, in essence, an argument for the interconnectedness of nations, a declaration that America's fate could not be separated from the destiny of those fighting for freedom across the Atlantic. It was both a call to arms and a call to conscience, a reminder that the survival of democracy depends not only on battlefield victories, but on the willingness of free peoples to defend their values before it is too late. Through its blend of realism and idealism, fear and hope, warning and promise, the speech remains one of the most eloquent articulations of the responsibilities that accompany freedom and the dangers that arise when democracies turn inward at the moment they are most needed. Even today, its themes, global interdependence, the fragility of liberty, the necessity of collective action, resonate with striking relevance, underscoring why Roosevelt's words continued to be studied, quoted, and remembered as a defining moment in the history of American leadership. By the end of the 1930s, the world stood at the edge of a precipice, caught between the lingering wounds of the First World War and the gathering storms of a second, far more devastating conflict. The diplomatic map of the globe was being redrawn not by treaties or peaceful negotiation, but by the relentless aggression of authoritarian regimes determined to expand their influence by force. Nations that had once trusted in the collective promise of post-World War I stability found themselves confronting a world order collapsing under the weight of unchecked militarism, shattered economic systems, and political extremism. It was against this grim backdrop that the United States faced a defining question: whether to remain in isolation behind the safety of two oceans or acknowledge the unmistakable reality that global conflict would eventually demand a moral, economic, and strategic response. Europe had become the epicenter of crisis, a continent whose borders were being consumed by German expansionism under Adolf Hitler. The Treaty of Versailles, once heralded as the guarantor of peace, lay in ruins as the Nazi regime openly defied its restrictions, rebuilding military forces and projecting power with a confidence born of international hesitation. The annexation of Austria in 1938, achieved with minimal resistance, sent a chilling message. Hitler's ambitions were not confined to rhetoric. The subsequent dismemberment of Czechoslovakia under the Munich Agreement only deepened the growing realization that appeasement had failed. Western democracies, still haunted by the trauma of the Great War, had attempted to preserve peace by yielding territory and concessions, but their reluctance to confront aggression merely emboldened the dictator who sought to reshape Europe in the image of a totalitarian ideal. As Europe struggled to maintain its balance, the rise of militaristic empires in Asia and Africa added new dimensions to the global crisis. Japan's invasion of China in 1937 marked a critical turning point in East Asia, setting off a brutal conflict that would eventually merge with the wider sweep of World War II. Tokyo's leaders believed that Japan's survival depended on dominating the Asian continent and securing access to vital resources, and they pursued this goal through ruthless campaigns that shocked the international community. Meanwhile, Italy, under the fascist leadership of Benito Mussolini, embraced imperial ambition in Africa, invading Ethiopia in 1935 and signaling its commitment to fascist expansion. The League of Nations, conceived as a unifying force for global peace, proved incapable of restraining these aggressors, its condemnations rendered meaningless in the face of bold territorial conquests. By 1939, the world's fragile equilibrium collapsed entirely. Germany's invasion of Poland in September triggered a chain reaction, prompting Britain and France to declare war and plunging Europe into open conflict. The speed and brutality of the German blitzkrieg stunned observers everywhere, revealing not only the terrifying effectiveness of mechanized warfare, but also the vulnerability of nations unprepared for rapid, coordinated military assaults. Within weeks, Poland was overwhelmed, and the grim reality of a new global war settled heavily upon the world. The fall of France in 1940 further intensified the sense of crisis. Once considered one of Europe's strongest military powers, France succumbed with shocking rapidity, forcing the evacuation at Dunkirk and leaving Great Britain alone to face the German war machine. In the Western Hemisphere, the United States grappled with its own internal contradictions as it watched these events unfold. Memories of the First World War remained raw, fueling widespread reluctance to become entangled in another overseas conflict. Isolationism was a powerful force in American political culture, strengthened by economic hardship during the Great Depression and a profound desire to avoid the sacrifices demanded by war. Many Americans believed that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans provided an impenetrable buffer, insulating the nation from foreign threats. Yet, even as this sentiment shaped public opinion, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that the nation could not remain indifferent to a world descending into chaos. Economic systems were interconnected, strategic balances were shifting, and the expansion of authoritarian regimes posed dangers that could not be contained by distance alone. Roosevelt understood that the United States faced a historic choice. The world's democracies were struggling for survival, and Britain, despite its resilience, stood in desperate need of support. If the British Isles fell, the consequences for global freedom would be catastrophic. A German-dominated Europe, combined with expansionist powers in Asia, would leave the United States isolated in a world controlled by hostile empires, an outcome that threatened both American security and the ideals the nation claimed to uphold. Roosevelt also recognized that modern warfare had evolved in ways that rendered traditional notions of geographic safety obsolete. Advances in aviation, naval power, and industrial production meant that wars could span continents, and the victors would be those with the capacity to mobilize vast economic resources swiftly and efficiently. At the same time, Roosevelt faced fierce resistance from political factions determined to keep the United States out of international conflict. Organizations like the America First Committee argued that foreign wars were the product of distant disputes and that American involvement would bring only unnecessary suffering. The debate over intervention versus isolation defined the political atmosphere of the late 1930s, creating a contentious environment in which Roosevelt had to tread carefully. However, as the crisis deepened and German bombing raids devastated British cities, more Americans began to question the wisdom of strict non-involvement. The stark reality of modern totalitarianism increasingly challenged the belief that the United States could remain untouched by events unfolding abroad. This volatile global context set the stage for Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech, delivered on December 29, 1940. It was more than a radio address. It was a moment of national reckoning. By invoking the metaphor of an arsenal, a place where weapons are built not for conquest but for defense, Roosevelt sought to redefine America's role in the world. He aimed to persuade a deeply divided public that supporting the democracies fighting for survival was not an act of war, but a necessary measure of self-preservation. The speech emerged from the realization that the United States possessed unmatched industrial potential, and that this capacity could determine the outcome of the global struggle. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood better than any political leader of his era that words could reshape national identity, redirect public sentiment, and redefine the boundaries of political possibility. When he prepared the Arsenal of Democracy address for delivery on December 29, 1940, he was not merely crafting a speech, he was engineering a doctrine, a new ideological framework that would guide the United States from a position of uncertain detachment to one of decisive global influence. The speech served both as a warning and an invitation, calling on Americans to re-examine their place in a world engulfed by tyranny. It was a delicate balancing act that required Roosevelt to confront the dangers of fascist expansion while reassuring an anxious public that supporting embattled democracies did not require direct American participation in the war. Chapter 2 explores how Roosevelt built this doctrine through a masterful combination of moral argument, strategic framing, and emotional persuasion. Roosevelt's rhetorical strategy was shaped by an acute awareness of the political landscape he faced. Public opinion in 1940 was deeply divided. Many Americans sympathized with Britain and the nations resisting Nazi aggression, yet millions also feared that any form of support would inevitably lead to war. Roosevelt's challenge was to bridge these competing instincts. He needed to demonstrate that the threat abroad was real and unavoidable, while simultaneously making the case that action short of war, specifically industrial and economic assistance, would be sufficient to protect American security. To achieve this balance, Roosevelt constructed his message around three pillars: the moral legitimacy of aiding democracies, the economic and strategic necessity of doing so, and the reassurance that such aid did not mean sending American soldiers into battle. A central component of Roosevelt's rhetorical approach was the careful presentation of the global conflict as a battle between two irreconcilable systems, democracy and dictatorship. He emphasized that the struggle was not a remote quarrel among foreign powers, but a direct challenge to the values and freedoms Americans cherished. By framing the conflict as existential, Roosevelt sought to dissolve the boundary between domestic interests and foreign events. If Germany succeeded in conquering Britain, he argued, the result would be a militarized world order dominated by authoritarian powers, a world in which American democratic institutions could not survive. This argument was designed to dismantle isolationist illusions, demonstrating that neutrality in the face of global tyranny was equivalent to self-delusion. Roosevelt insisted that democracy was not a static inheritance, but a living system that required active defense. One of Roosevelt's most effective rhetorical choices was his use of vivid, accessible language. He avoided abstract political theory and instead relied on metaphors and imagery that ordinary Americans could understand. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" emerged as the defining symbol of this strategy. By invoking the image of an arsenal, a facility dedicated to producing weapons for defense rather than aggression, Roosevelt crafted a metaphor that encapsulated America's potential role in the conflict. The United States would not be a combatant. It would be the supplier, the industrial backbone that made victory possible for those already fighting on the front lines. This framing transformed the act of providing arms, ships, and aircraft into an expression of moral responsibility rather than military provocation. The metaphor also carried powerful implications about American identity, aligning national industry with the ideals of liberty and justice. Roosevelt's rhetorical mastery extended beyond metaphors. He understood the emotional climate of the nation, which was marked by fear, fatigue, and lingering trauma from the First World War. Many Americans believed that the country had been drawn into the previous conflict under false pretenses and did not want to repeat the mistake. Roosevelt sought to counter these fears by presenting support for Britain not as a reckless leap into war, but as a prudent, carefully measured response to a rapidly changing world. He reassured listeners that, while the United States must act decisively, it could do so without sacrificing the lives of its young men. There will be no American warships sent into foreign waters, he promised, using a soothing tone that combined firmness with empathy. This reassurance was not an attempt to deceive the public, but to build trust at a moment when skepticism toward international commitments remained high. The president also understood the importance of establishing credibility through evidence and logic. Throughout the speech, Roosevelt presented a detailed assessment of the threat posed by Nazi Germany. He cited Germany's industrial capacity, military reach, and demonstrated willingness to annihilate entire nations. By drawing on concrete facts and strategic analysis, he positioned himself as a leader who understood the military and geopolitical stakes. This analytical foundation gave weight to his moral appeals, demonstrating that the crisis was not speculative but grounded in observable reality. Roosevelt's combination of moral urgency and empirical detail elevated his argument beyond partisan debate, framing it as a matter of national survival. Another key aspect of Roosevelt's rhetorical strategy was his ability to appeal to a broad coalition of listeners. He avoided language that demonized isolationists, recognizing that berating opponents would only deepen divisions. Instead, he acknowledged the legitimate fears of those who wanted to avoid war and positioned his argument as a sensible middle ground between reckless intervention and passive disengagement. He invited Americans to rise above political differences and think in terms of shared national duty. This inclusive approach was essential in a moment when unity was both fragile and desperately needed. Roosevelt's skillful balancing act, firm in principle, yet empathetic in tone, helped ensure that his message resonated across the political spectrum. Perhaps the most ingenious element of Roosevelt's rhetorical strategy was his alignment of economic recovery with national defense. The Great Depression had left deep scars on American society, and millions of citizens still associated large-scale mobilization with the hardships of the 1930s. Roosevelt reversed this perception by presenting industrial expansion as both a patriotic duty and a path toward prosperity. Factories that had struggled during the Depression would now produce aircraft, tanks, ammunition, and naval vessels. Workers who had been unemployed would now find steady, meaningful labor. Roosevelt's framing transformed rearmament from a burden into an opportunity, linking individual well-being with national security. Roosevelt also made brilliant use of the emotional power of radio. The fireside chat format had already become one of the most trusted channels of communication in American political life. The intimacy of radio allowed Roosevelt to speak directly to families in their homes, bypassing the distortions of newspapers and political rhetoric. He spoke calmly, confidently, and with deliberate clarity, creating the impression that he was sitting beside the listener and offering guidance in a moment of uncertainty. This sense of personal connection amplified the impact of his message, fostering trust at a time when trust was essential to inspiring national action. The speech's structure further reinforced its persuasive power. Roosevelt began by acknowledging the seriousness of the global crisis, carefully outlining the stakes before moving toward his central thesis. Then he offered reassurances, clearly stating that the United States would not enter the war. Only after establishing this foundation did he introduce the key concept of the arsenal of democracy. This progression allowed listeners to absorb the argument gradually, reducing resistance by grounding his message in shared concerns. The conclusion of the speech returned to moral principles, emphasizing the timeless struggle between freedom and tyranny. Roosevelt used this moral framing to elevate the debate above partisan politics, reminding listeners that the fate of democracy around the world was deeply intertwined with America's own destiny. When Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy, he was not merely announcing a policy. He was redefining the nature of modern warfare and the role of industrial power in shaping global outcomes. Chapter 3 explores the profound meaning behind this phrase, showing how Roosevelt transformed factories, assembly lines, and raw industrial capacity into the central weapons of a new kind of war. In the 20th century, more than ever before, victory hinged not only on the bravery of soldiers, but on the nations that could outproduce their enemies, sustain long-term conflict, and supply their allies. Roosevelt understood that the United States, with its immense productive potential, was uniquely positioned to serve as the industrial bulwark of democratic nations under siege. The arsenal of democracy thus became a revolutionary concept, signaling a shift from military isolation to economic warfare in defense of freedom. Roosevelt's vision emerged from a clear-eyed assessment of the global situation. Europe lay in ruins. Britain, the last major democracy resisting Nazi domination, faced dire shortages of aircraft, ammunition, ships, and essential supplies. Germany, by contrast, had spent years preparing for total war, rearming at a pace unmatched by any other nation. Its factories turned out tanks, planes, and weapons in staggering quantities, supported by a mobilized population and a tightly controlled economy. If Britain were to withstand this assault, it needed enormous industrial support, and only one nation could provide it: the United States. Roosevelt's call to become an arsenal was thus both practical and visionary, grounded in the recognition that America's role in the world would be defined not by military engagement, at least not yet, but by industrial output of unprecedented scale. To grasp the significance of this strategy, one must understand how deeply the Great Depression had affected American industry. Throughout the 1930s, factories had closed, production had slowed, and unemployment soared. The country's immense industrial infrastructure was operating far below its potential. Roosevelt saw an opportunity in this dormant capacity, a chance to ignite production not only to strengthen democracy abroad, but also to accelerate America's own economic recovery. The arsenal would supply weapons to the world while giving jobs to millions at home, transforming idle facilities into vibrant centers of national purpose. This convergence of moral duty and economic revival was a cornerstone of Roosevelt's argument that helping other nations survive fascism would simultaneously help America rise from economic stagnation. In this new industrial doctrine, the workforce became just as important as soldiers on a battlefield. Roosevelt emphasized that every factory worker riveting steel, assembling engines, or forging armor plates contributed directly to the defense of democracy. This message carried immense symbolic value. It democratized the war effort by giving ordinary citizens a role in shaping global outcomes even before the United States formally entered the war. In kitchens, workshops, mills, and shipyards, Americans understood that their labor carried strategic weight. A bomber rolling off a Detroit assembly line, a merchant vessel built in Baltimore, or a rifle produced in Springfield became extensions of American power in the hands of Allied soldiers. Roosevelt's framing transformed industry from a domestic economic activity into a weapon of international consequence. The scale of production that Roosevelt envisioned was unprecedented. The United States would need to produce aircraft by the tens of thousands, ships by the hundreds, and munitions in quantities never before imagined. Private companies, from automobile giants like Ford and General Motors to smaller manufacturers, would have to reorient their entire operations toward war production. This required a level of cooperation between government and industry that had no precedent in American history. Roosevelt approached this challenge by appealing to patriotism, emphasizing not only the necessity but the honor of participating in what he described as a global struggle for human freedom. Through speeches, meetings, and national broadcasts, he mobilized industrial leaders to accept the monumental responsibility of rearming the democratic world. The government also began to develop mechanisms to streamline and coordinate industrial expansion. Agencies such as the Office of Production Management were created to oversee the allocation of materials, standardize production, and eliminate bottlenecks. Roosevelt recognized that centralized coordination was essential to prevent delays, inefficiencies, or competition among manufacturers for resources. The mobilization of industry required steel, aluminum, rubber, copper, and countless other materials in quantities that would strain existing supply chains. Yet Roosevelt's confidence in America's ability to scale production was unshakable. He believed that the nation's entrepreneurial spirit, when combined with government direction, could generate output on a scale that would overwhelm totalitarian regimes. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" also carried an important ideological dimension. Roosevelt's vision was not simply about producing weapons, it was about demonstrating the superiority of democratic capitalism over fascist authoritarianism. Totalitarian states had centralized control, forced labor, and rigid planning. But Roosevelt believed that free workers in a free society, motivated by shared purpose rather than coercion, could surpass them. He challenged the assumption that dictatorships possessed inherent advantages in mobilizing populations. The American arsenal, driven by voluntary cooperation and democratic values, would become a living argument against the idea that freedom made nations weak or indecisive. Roosevelt's doctrine also acknowledged the changing nature of modern warfare. No longer did armies rely solely on infantry or cavalry. Wars were now fought with machines, aircraft capable of reaching distant cities, tanks that could crush fortifications, and ships that could control vast ocean territories. These machines required complex manufacturing processes that only advanced industrial nations could sustain. Thus, industrial capacity became synonymous with national power. Roosevelt's speech recognized this shift and positioned the United States as the nation best equipped to provide the technological and logistical backbone of the democratic world. America's factories became its strongest fortifications, capable of reaching battlefields thousands of miles away. Life on the industrial front lines reflected this enormous transformation. Workers in factories across the country adapted to new roles, learned new skills, and endured long hours to meet production demands. Women entered the workforce in increasing numbers, forming the foundation of the wartime labor revolution that would later become an iconic part of American history. Immigrant communities, African American workers, and rural migrants all contributed to the industrial surge. These social changes were not immediate, nor were they without conflict, but they signaled a profound shift in the fabric of American society. Roosevelt's call to become an arsenal brought millions into productive labor, altering family roles, workplace norms, and economic opportunities in ways that would endure long after the war. By late 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt faced one of the most hostile and consequential political battles of his presidency, convincing a deeply divided American public that the nation could no longer afford to remain detached from the growing global conflict. Isolationism was not a fringe sentiment. It was a powerful mainstream force shaped by trauma, skepticism, economic hardship, and bitter memories of World War I. Chapter 4 explores how Roosevelt confronted this entrenched ideology, how he engaged directly with his critics, and how the arsenal of democracy speech became his most formidable weapon in shifting the national mindset. To understand the magnitude of this challenge, one must appreciate how profoundly isolationism shaped American political identity, and how Roosevelt, through strategy, persuasion, and moral framing, dismantled the illusion that oceans alone could protect the United States from global tyranny. Isolationism did not begin with the 1930s, but the Great Depression and the disillusionment surrounding World War I had transformed it into a political force that transcended party lines. Millions of Americans believed that the previous war had been a catastrophic mistake, entered not for noble ideals, but because of deception, propaganda, and the manipulations of arms manufacturers and bankers. The findings of the WWII Committee, which investigated profiteering during World War I, reinforced suspicions that economic motives had driven the nation into conflict. These sentiments hardened into legislation, including the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, which restricted America's ability to provide weapons, loans, or assistance to warring nations. Roosevelt inherited this deeply skeptical environment and understood that any call for rearmament or foreign involvement risked triggering fierce backlash. The most vocal organization championing isolationism was the America First Committee. Created in 1940, it quickly became one of the largest anti-war movements in U.S. history, claiming hundreds of thousands of members and support from prominent public figures, politicians, and business leaders. The group argued that America's priority should be defending its own borders, not supporting foreign nations in conflicts they viewed as distant power struggles. Figures like Charles Lindbergh, the aviation hero of the 1920s, became symbols of the movement, warning that aiding Britain would inevitably drag the United States into war. Lindbergh and others insisted that America should build an impregnable defense system and remain neutral regardless of the fate of Europe. Roosevelt, however, recognized the fatal flaw in this argument. Neutrality in the face of fascist expansion was not neutrality at all. It was complicity by inaction. To counter isolationism, Roosevelt needed more than policy proposals. He needed a narrative that challenged the foundational assumptions of his critics. The arsenal of democracy speech became the centerpiece of this effort. Roosevelt's rhetorical approach was deliberate and multifaceted. He began by acknowledging the fears and concerns of isolationists rather than dismissing them. This allowed him to speak to a broad audience without alienating those who opposed intervention. By presenting his argument as a shared national concern rather than a partisan debate, Roosevelt positioned himself as a unifying leader rather than an ideologue. One of Roosevelt's most effective strategies was to redefine the concept of national defense. Isolationists believed that geographic distance offered natural protection. Roosevelt shattered this illusion by describing a world transformed by modern technology. With long-range aircraft, powerful naval fleets, and expanding military capacity, authoritarian regimes could project power across oceans. Roosevelt emphasized that if Britain fell, the Atlantic Ocean would no longer be a protective barrier but a gateway for aggression. The threat was not theoretical, it was imminent. By reframing global conflict as a direct American security concern, Roosevelt forced isolationists to confront the dangers of their position. Roosevelt also challenged the isolationist claim that America could simply strengthen its own defenses and remain neutral. He argued that defensive preparations alone were insufficient if the United States faced a world dominated by hostile powers. The best defense, he contended, was to support Britain while it could still fight. If Britain fell, America would face the full strength of the Axis powers without allies, without buffer zones, and without time to prepare. The arsenal concept thus became a strategic argument. By supplying weapons rather than troops, the United States could keep the war abroad and prevent it from reaching American shores. Roosevelt framed this approach as a middle path between doing nothing and entering the war directly, a path that appealed to the anxieties of a population desperate to avoid sending its sons into combat. Another core pillar of Roosevelt's strategy involved confronting the isolationist moral argument. While isolationists often framed their stance as pragmatic, Roosevelt viewed it as a dangerous abdication of moral responsibility. Democracies around the world were fighting not for conquest, but for survival, and the fall of those democracies would represent a triumph of tyranny over human freedom. Roosevelt insisted that the United States, as a nation founded on democratic principles, bore a moral obligation to support those resisting oppression. This was not a call for crusading intervention, but a recognition that the values Americans cherished were under direct threat. By moralizing the stakes of the conflict, Roosevelt transformed support for Britain into an expression of national character and ethical duty. The president also countered isolationist arguments by exposing the propaganda techniques used by totalitarian regimes. He warned Americans that Hitler sought to weaken the United States by dividing public opinion and fostering hostility toward foreign involvement. Roosevelt pointed out that Nazi Germany had mastered the art of misinformation, spreading false narratives to manipulate democratic societies. By highlighting these methods, he sought to immunize the public against isolationist claims that aligned, unintentionally or not, with the goals of enemy powers. Roosevelt did not accuse isolationists of treason. Instead, he suggested that they were being misled by a sophisticated adversary. This approach enabled him to challenge their views without attacking their patriotism. Roosevelt also understood that words alone would not dispel isolationist fears. He needed to make concrete policy decisions that demonstrated his commitment to keeping the United States out of direct combat while still supporting Britain. Programs like Cash and Carry, which required Britain to pay for and transport its own supplies, were designed to reassure the public that no American lives or ships were at risk. Gradually, Roosevelt expanded these efforts toward greater aid, culminating in the Lend-Lease proposal, which would allow the United States to provide material without immediate payment. The arsenal of democracy speech served as both justification and preparation for this dramatic policy shift. It laid the emotional and intellectual groundwork for Lend-Lease by explaining why such aid was crucial, inevitable, and aligned with American interests. The political risks Roosevelt took during this period cannot be overstated. The 1940 presidential election had been one of the most contentious in American history, with critics accusing Roosevelt of seeking to drag the nation into war. He walked a tightrope between honesty and reassurance, warning of the danger abroad while promising that American troops would not be sent into battle. His opponents argued that this promise was a deception, but Roosevelt insisted it was possible, and at that moment, it was. The arsenal of democracy strategy allowed him to take bold steps without violating the trust of the American people. Most importantly, it allowed the nation to prepare for conflict long before Pearl Harbor made involvement inevitable. The Arsenal of Democracy speech delivered by Franklin D. Roosevelt on December 29, 1940, stands as one of the crucial turning points in American history, a moment when the United States began shifting from a nation defined by wariness and internal focus to a global leader whose actions would shape the outcome of World War II and the geopolitical landscape that followed. Chapter 5 explores the profound and far-reaching legacy of the speech, showing how a single broadcast to the American public sparked industrial transformation, influenced political identity, altered national consciousness, and laid the foundations for America's emergence as the dominant democratic power in the post-war world. It also examines the immediate effects of the speech, tracing how Roosevelt's doctrine reshaped policy, galvanized public support, and prepared the United States for the eventual challenges that would come with full-scale war. In the immediate aftermath of the speech, its impact was felt most strongly in public opinion. Although the nation remained cautious about entering the war, Roosevelt's argument that aiding democracies abroad was essential for America's own security resonated more deeply than previous appeals. Polling conducted in early 1941 showed a noticeable shift. Americans increasingly supported sending weapons, ships, aircraft, and supplies to Britain, so long as it did not require direct military involvement. For millions of listeners, Roosevelt had clarified the stakes with unprecedented clarity. He had transformed a complex geopolitical crisis into a narrative of moral and strategic responsibility. This shift in public attitude created the political space needed for the next major development, the Lend-Lease Act. Signed into law in March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act represented the practical realization of Roosevelt's vision. It allowed the United States to supply military aid to nations whose defense was deemed essential to American security, effectively making the country the material backbone of the Allied war effort. Billions of dollars worth of equipment flowed from American factories to Britain, China, and eventually the Soviet Union. Weapons, trucks, tanks, aircraft, and raw materials were shipped across oceans in unprecedented quantities. The program would ultimately deliver over $50 billion in aid, an enormous sum for the era, and a testament to the transformative power of Roosevelt's doctrine. Without the philosophical and emotional groundwork laid by the Arsenal of Democracy speech, such a sweeping policy might never have gained enough public or political support to pass. The speech's industrial legacy was equally profound. In the months that followed, American factories began reorganizing on a massive scale. Plants that once produced consumer goods shifted rapidly to manufacturing engines, artillery shells, aircraft frames, and naval components. This reorientation required not only technological adaptation, but also structural reform. Companies had to retool machinery, retrain employees, expand facilities, and collaborate with government agencies to coordinate production. Roosevelt's call to action had effectively launched the largest industrial mobilization in American history. Ford Motor Company, for instance, turned its famous River Rouge complex toward producing military vehicles, while aircraft companies such as Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed expanded their factories into sprawling wartime hubs. The United States soon began producing planes and ships at a rate that stunned both its allies and its enemies. This industrial explosion brought sweeping social change. The workforce grew dramatically as millions of Americans found employment in factories, shipyards, and manufacturing centers across the country. Women entered the industrial workforce in numbers never before seen, forming the foundation of what would later become the iconic Rosie the Riveter era. African Americans, immigrants, and rural migrants sought new opportunities in urban industrial centers, accelerating demographic shifts that would reshape American society. Labor unions expanded, wages rose, and the economic stagnation of the Great Depression began to recede. Roosevelt's speech had framed industrial growth as a patriotic duty, and Americans responded by committing themselves to the collective project of defending democracy through production. The concept of the arsenal also took on symbolic meaning in the domestic political landscape. It became a rallying point for a new sense of national identity, one defined not by isolation or detachment, but by engagement, resilience, and moral purpose. For decades, the United States had wrestled with the question of whether it should play an active role in global affairs. The speech offered an answer that balanced caution with leadership. America could defend its values without rushing headlong into military conflict. This ideological shift laid the groundwork for America's eventual entry into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. By the time that tragic event occurred, the nation was already partially mobilized, industrially, psychologically, and politically, and thus better prepared to confront the monumental challenge ahead. In a broader sense, the Arsenal of Democracy speech helped redefine the meaning of democracy itself in the 20th century. Roosevelt argued that democracy was not simply a domestic political system, but a moral and strategic obligation. It required defense, investment, solidarity, and the willingness to support those who fought to preserve it. This conception would continue to shape American foreign policy for decades, forming the philosophical foundation for the Marshall Plan, the establishment of NATO, and the broader strategy of containment during the Cold War. The idea that America had a responsibility, indeed a duty, to use its industrial, economic, and moral resources to support global freedom became a defining feature of its international identity. Internationally, the speech reshaped how America was viewed by its allies. For Britain, it was a lifeline. Under siege from relentless German bombing raids, isolated from continental Europe, and suffering from severe material shortages, Britain desperately needed a sign that it would not stand alone. Roosevelt's speech offered not only reassurance but a strategic commitment to ongoing material support. Winston Churchill recognized immediately that the speech marked a turning point. In private correspondence, he described it as a new dawn, a moment when the United States had made clear its intention to stand against tyranny even before formally entering the war. This strengthened morale in Britain and signaled to occupied nations across Europe that the forces of democracy had not been defeated. The speech's legacy also extended to the Axis powers. Germany recognized that America's industrial might, once fully mobilized, posed a significant threat. Adolf Hitler and his military strategists understood that if the United States began supplying limitless weapons and resources to the Allies, the balance of the war could shift dramatically. This recognition influenced strategic decisions, including Germany's eventual declaration of war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, a decision many historians consider one of Hitler's gravest mistakes. Roosevelt's speech thus played a role not only in mobilizing American power, but also in shaping the strategic calculations of its enemies. On the home front, the speech helped foster unity at a time of growing political tension. Although isolationists continued to oppose intervention, the moral force of Roosevelt's argument gradually weakened their influence. The war of ideas that had divided the nation for years began to shift toward a consensus that aiding the Allies was both practical and morally right.